The neighborhood was quiet that evening, the kind of calm that almost felt staged, with lawns freshly trimmed and driveways lined with neatly parked cars, except for the one glaring violation: a shiny white SUV that didn't belong where it stood, jammed awkwardly in front of Marcus's garage. Marcus, a hard-working black homeowner who had dealt with his share of whispers and sideways glances in this HOA-controlled community, froze as he realized the vehicle wasn't just blocking his garage, it was asterisk inside asterisk it. His stomach tightened. Not because he hadn't faced boldness from the neighborhood's self-proclaimed rule enforcer before, but because this time she had crossed a line so outrageous, so personal, that it left no room for misunderstanding. Karen, the HOA's loudest voice and sharpest critic, had decided that Marcus's garage was somehow hers to use. Sliding her car in, as if it were an extra parking lot provided just for her entitlement, he stood in the driveway, heart pounding, anger mixing with disbelief, imagining the countless times she'd nitpicked his home letters about his grass being too long, complaints about the color of his trash bins, even whispered remarks about certain people lowering the neighborhood's value. But this was different. This wasn't just a violation of space. It was an invasion, a blatant display that she believed rules didn't apply to her, and that Marcus, because of his skin, somehow didn't deserve the same respect as his white neighbors. He felt his palms tighten around the garage remote as he realized he had the power to change the script. One click and her car would be locked inside. One decision that would turn the tables on the woman who had spent months trying to humiliate him. He could almost hear her reaction, already screaming, demanding, calling the HOA for backup. But tonight would be different. Tonight, Karen wasn't in control. And for once, the neighborhood would see who really held the power. As he slowly lifted the remote, the air around him seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of years of subtle racism and entitlement boiling into this single moment. A moment that would decide whether Marcus stayed silent, as always, or finally stood up, not just for himself, but for every injustice that had been brushed aside as just the way things are. Marcus had lived in the Oak Ridge Estates neighborhood for just under 3 years, long enough to know that while the houses stood tall with their beige paint and stone facades, the smiles of many neighbors were paper-thin, polite only when it was convenient, and judgmental the moment backs were turned. He was proud of the home he had purchased, proud of the sweat and sacrifice it took to get here, but he couldn't ignore the whispers that seemed to follow him. The sidelong glances when he mowed his lawn in the evening, or when his sister stopped by in her beat-up car after work. From the beginning, Karen, the self-appointed guardian of HOA standards, made it her mission to remind Marcus that he was an outsider, filing complaint after complaint for the most minor things, his grass being a half-inch too high, his trash bins visible for an hour too long, even the color of his welcome mat that she claimed didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic. Marcus had learned to brush it off, telling himself that dignity meant not lowering himself to pettiness, but deep down he knew her actions weren't just about rules. They were about control, about entitlement, about reminding him where she thought he belonged. The neighborhood itself was deceptively serene. Rows of identical two-story homes with manicured lawns that looked like a postcard for the American dream. Yet underneath that surface was a tension Marcus felt daily, a reminder that some saw him not as an equal homeowner, but as a man tolerated in their space. Still, Marcus kept his head down, working long hours at his job as an IT consultant, saving for the future, dreaming of raising a family in a community where children could ride bikes freely and neighbors could wave without hidden judgment. What made Karen's behavior so insidious was how she cloaked it in concern for the HOA, twisting her words into false politeness when others were around, but sharpening them into daggers when it was just her and Marcus. She would smile in public, then leave nasty notes taped to his garage door about property value and standards. Her handwriting so distinct, it burned into his memory. Curiosity became a seed in Marcus's mind. Why was she so obsessed with him? Did she see him as a threat? Did his success, his home, his very presence challenge her sense of superiority in this carefully controlled bubble? He had endured it for months, but the day he found her car parked inside his garage, bold as daylight, was the day everything shifted. That single act didn't just cross a boundary, it demolished it, and for the first time, Marcus felt a spark of something he had long suppressed, an urge not just to endure, but to resist, to expose her entitlement for what it was. The irony wasn't lost on him. She had spent years accusing him of being a problem for the neighborhood. Yet here she was, trespassing, abusing her power, assuming she could act without consequence. What Karen didn't know was that Marcus had grown up learning resilience in environments far less forgiving than Oak Ridge Estates. He had faced dismissive teachers, bosses who underestimated him, strangers who clutched their purses tighter when he walked by. And each time he had found a way to move forward with grace. But this time, in this quiet suburb that prided itself on rules, he realized he had leverage, a way to turn her own arrogance against her. The garage door remote in his hand wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol, a line between silence and action. Between letting yet another act of racism slide, or finally forcing the community to see the truth. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pristine driveways and flower beds, Marcus knew that the decision he was about to make would ripple far. Beyond a petty parking dispute, would become a story about dignity, justice, and the cost of unchecked entitlement. Marcus could feel the pulse in his temples as he stared at the garage. The sight of Karen's white SUV, sitting arrogantly inside his private space, gnawing at him like an open wound. Because it wasn't just a car in the wrong place, it was the culmination of years of thinly veiled hostility, whispered comments, an open disrespect that had worn on him since the day he moved into Oak Ridge Estates. And the sheer audacity of her act now boiled in his chest like fire, daring him to let it slide the way he had so many times before. But this time, something inside him resisted, something raw and unmovable. As though every past injustice had gathered here tonight, demanding to be answered. He remembered the first warning letter she sent through the HOA, her neat handwriting criticizing the length of his grass as though it were a crime against humanity. And the way she had stood on her porch, watching him read it, smirking with satisfaction, as though she had just restored order to the world. And he remembered the neighborhood meeting when she stood up to complain about certain residents, making the community less desirable, her eyes cutting straight to him while the others nodded awkwardly, no one daring to call her out. For years, Marcus had chosen peace, telling himself that responding would only give her more ammunition. That silence was strength. But silence had only emboldened her, made her bolder, more reckless, until now she had walked straight into his garage like she owned it, leaving him with a choice he could no longer avoid, endure, or resist. His hand tightened around the garage remote, the plastic edges pressing into his skin, and he thought about how quickly narratives flipped in this world, how easily he could be painted as the aggressor if he acted, how often Black men like him had been vilified for defending themselves while their oppressors were excused as misunderstood, and the weight of that possibility made his heart pound. But, alongside the fear came clarity. If he let this slide, he would forever be the man who allowed himself to be disrespected, who allowed racism to live unchallenged under the banner of HOA rules. Slowly, deliberately, he pressed the button, and the garage door began to hum and lower. Metal grinding against metal, as though even the machinery understood the weight of what it was doing, sealing her car inside, like justice descending. And for the first time, Marcus felt not powerless, not cornered, but in control. He didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, his phone buzzed, and sure enough, the HOA group chat lit up with Karen's frantic typing, her words appearing in a string of accusations that twisted reality so quickly, it made Marcus's head spin. Urgent. Marcus has locked my car in his garage. I need help immediately. HOA. This is unacceptable. He almost laughed at the absurdity how quickly she had framed herself as the victim, skipping over the fact that she had trespassed, that she had parked her car where it had no right to be. But his amusement faded when he saw neighbors chiming in, some confused but others already siding with her, demanding explanations as though her story must automatically be true. The injustice of it hit Marcus hard, the realization that even with her caught, red-handed, many people would still assume he was the problem, still assume the black man must be guilty of something. And that thought made his chest tighten with both fear and fury. He opened his security camera app and pulled up the footage. Watching the recording of Karen brazenly pulling into his garage as though she owned it, stepping out with that same smug expression she always wore when she thought she had one. And for once, he felt a surge of relief, undeniable and irrefutable, that he wasn't imagining things, that the injustice wasn't just in his head. But even with evidence, he knew the game. People like Karen didn't need facts to hold power, they needed perception. And perception could be twisted with enough outrage, enough noise, enough appeals to rules and safety. As if to confirm his thoughts, his phone buzzed again, this time with a private message from her. Open the garage now, or you'll regret it. The board will hear about this. People like you don't last long in neighborhoods like ours. Marcus's stomach dropped. The words slicing into him deeper than any insult, because they carried centuries of weight. People like you, 3 words that revealed the truth she had hidden behind HOA letters and petty complaints. 3 words that said out loud what he had always known but others ignored. That, in her eyes, he didn't belong, not because of his grass, not because of his bins, but because of his skin. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from fury. From the ache of years of being diminished, dismissed, disrespected. And for a moment he considered pressing the button again, opening the garage and letting her go, just to avoid the escalation. But then he pictured the look she would give him if he did the smirk, the satisfaction, the unspoken victory, and something inside him hardened. Not this time. Not again. As the minutes passed, neighbors began stepping outside, drawn by the commotion, whispering to each other as they peeked over fences and across lawns. And Marcus realized the entire street was becoming an audience to this silent standoff. A suburban theater where the curtain had lifted and every action mattered. Karen's voice finally pierced the quiet. Muffled shouts from behind the garage door as she pounded on it, her words angry, shrill, demanding freedom as though she were the victim of some cruel injustice, rather than the perpetrator of her own arrogance. And Marcus stood still, watching, his jaw tight, his chest heavy, knowing that this moment was no longer just about him and hurt, was about the kind of community Oak Ridge Estates truly was, about whether entitlement would once again be rewarded, or whether dignity, respect, and truth would finally hold their ground. Every second stretched longer, every shout from Karen louder, every glance from the neighbors heavier, until the air itself felt thick with tension, with history. With the weight of battles fought long before Marcus ever set foot in this neighborhood. Battles his father and grandfather had endured, battles that reminded him that resistance was never easy but always necessary. And as he stood there, holding the garage remote, like a shield, Marcus knew that whatever happened next would not just define his place in Oak Ridge Estates, but send a message far louder than Karen's screams. That silence had ended. That justice had been locked in with her SUV, and that this time the narrative would not belong to her. The night air thickened with tension as Marcus stood rooted in his driveway, the garage door locked tight, Karen's SUV entombed inside like a monument to arrogance, and the neighbors gathering around began to whisper louder, the crowd growing with each minute, their curiosity feeding the drama, until the entire cul-de-sac felt like a stage where every breath, every glance, every word mattered. Karen's voice, shrill and furious, carried through the thin barrier of the garage door, each pounding fist against the metal echoing through Marcus's chest as if daring him to open it, daring him to fold under the pressure of her rage. But instead, he stood taller, clutching the remote in his hand like it was both a weapon and a shield, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest, because he knew this wasn't just about her car. It was about years of being disrespected, dismissed, written off, and this moment was his chance to flip the script, to turn her entitlement against her. Karen's muffled screams finally spilled out into the night when she found another exit, bursting through the side door of the garage with her face twisted in outrage, her hair wild, her phone already in her hand as she marched up the driveway like a storm unleashed, pointing at Marcus as though he were a criminal caught in the act. Shouting loud enough for every neighbor to hear, "He locked me in. He trapped me. This man is dangerous. You all saw it. The audacity of her words hit Marcus like ice water. But before he could even respond, several neighbors gasped, some muttering under their breath, already taking mental sides. The tension dividing the street like an invisible line, and Marcus felt the familiar sting of injustice creeping in. The fear that once again her lies would carry more weight than his truth. But then he remembered the phone in his pocket. The video footage he had pulled up earlier, and he raised it high. His voice, steady but firm, as he spoke. No. What you all saw is her trespassing into my garage. What you're hearing now is her trying to twist the truth. With trembling fingers he mirrored the footage onto his tablet and turned it toward the crowd. The glow of the screen lighting up faces as the video played Karen's car pulling confidently into his garage. Her smirk unmistakable, her arrogance undeniable. Her actions captured in crystal clarity. A hush fell over the group, whispers replaced by silence. Eyes widening as the reality sank in, and for the first time, Marcus saw Karen's confidence falter, her mouth opening and closing without words, her face draining of color as the evidence destroyed the narrative she had tried to spin. But entitlement dies hard, and she lashed out again. Voice trembling, but still defiant. That video doesn't show the whole story. He provoked me. He's been harassing me since he moved in. Marcus's jaw tightened, fury surging through him at the blatant lie. But before he could speak, another voice cut through the night. A neighbor, named Mrs. Rodriguez, who had quietly endured Karen's bullying for years, stepped forward, her tone sharp with long-suppressed anger. No, Karen, enough. We've all watched you target him from the day he moved in. We've all seen it. You're not the victim here. Heads turned toward her, then toward others. And soon, murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, a collective realization forming that the queen of the HOA was standing exposed, her crown of entitlement slipping in real time. And Marcus felt the tide shift as eyes that once judged him now looked at her with suspicion. Still, Karen wasn't finished. She turned to Marcus, her finger jabbing toward his chest, spitting venom with every word. You don't belong here. You think you can just walk in and take over like this neighborhood is yours? People like you ruin communities. The words, raw and ugly, sliced through the silence like a blade. And for a heartbeat, the entire street froze. The racism that had always lingered in subtext now screamed aloud for everyone to hear. Undeniable, unfiltered, impossible to excuse. Marcus's chest tightened, but instead of shrinking back, he stepped forward, his voice deep and unshaken, carrying the weight of generations. No, Karen. What ruins communities is hate. What ruins communities is people like you, who think rules don't apply when it's convenient, who think respect is something owed only to you. I bought this home. I've worked for it. I've earned it. And I won't let you or anyone else make me feel like I don't belong here. The words rang out like a gavel in a courtroom, and the effect was immediate. Neighbors who had remained silent began to nod. A few even clapped quietly, while Karen's face twisted with rage and panic, her body trembling as though the power she had wielded so easily was slipping through her fingers. She tried one last desperate move, dialing the police on her phone and putting it on speaker for everyone to hear. Her voice trembling with manufactured fear as she said, "Yes, officer, I need help. I'm being threatened by a man in my neighborhood." But before she could continue, Marcus lifted his tablet again, holding the paused video screen toward the crowd, his voice cutting her off. "This is what she calls being threatened. Her breaking into my garage, her stealing my space, her lying to you, and now lying to the police." The neighbors shifted uneasily, some shaking their heads, others muttering that enough was enough. And when the police arrived minutes later, the scene had already turned against her. The officers, watching the footage in silence before one of them asked Karen the question that sealed her fate. "Ma'am, can you explain why your car is in his garage without his permission?" Her silence was louder than her screams, her excuses evaporating under the weight of evidence. And for the first time, Marcus saw fear in her eyes, not fear of him, but fear of the truth, fear of losing the control she had clung to for so long. The climax of the night was not in her downfall, but in the shift it sparked, Neighbors who had once turned blind eyes now whispered apologies. Others voiced support, the power she wielded crumbling before their very eyes. And Marcus, though exhausted, stood taller than ever, knowing that in this moment, the narrative had changed, not because he shouted louder, but because he refused to be silent any longer. As the last of the police cars pulled away and the murmurs of the gathered neighbors faded back into the night, Marcus stood in the quiet of his driveway, the garage remote still in his hand, but feeling lighter now. No longer a weapon of defense, but a symbol of a line he had finally drawn. And for the first time since moving into Oak Ridge Estates, he felt seen not as an outsider struggling to prove his place, but as a man who had stood up to injustice and refused to be silenced. Karen's downfall wasn't marked by sirens or handcuffs, but by the stunned silence of a community that could no longer deny the truth, her words still hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned too long. Words that had unmasked her prejudice in front of everyone she had once controlled with fear and manipulation. In the days that followed, whispers turned into conversations, and conversations into change. The HOA board, once her weapon, was forced to confront the reality they had enabled. And neighbors who had looked away began to recognize their own silence as complicity. For Marcus, the victory wasn't about trapping her car or exposing her lies, it was about reclaiming his dignity. About proving that respect was not negotiable, that equality was not conditional, and that silence in the face of hate was never strength but surrender. The impact rippled far beyond a garage door, sparking something deeper, a reminder that communities are not defined by their rules or their facades, but by the courage of those willing to demand justice when it is most uncomfortable. And as Marcus locked his garage that night, the neighborhood finally quiet again. He whispered to himself the truth he had always known but now felt in his bones. You belong, and no one can take that away. The quiet stillness of Oak Ridge Estates, a neighborhood wrapped in manicured hedges and carefully painted smiles, had always carried an undertone Marcus could never quite ignore. The unspoken truth that though his name was on the deed and his mortgage paid on time, to some he would always be a visitor, an intruder, in a place that prided itself on uniformity and control. A place where the rules of the Homeowners Association were enforced with precision when aimed at him, but overlooked when applied to others. For years he tolerated the letters tucked into his mailbox, reminding him to repaint his shutters, though others peeled unnoticed. The notes about his grass being a shade too long, though his neighbors' lawns sprouted weeds. And the way Karen, the self-appointed guardian of order, always seemed to linger a little too long outside his home, clipboard in hand, eyes narrowing not at his property but at his presence. The day he came home to find her white SUV tucked into his garage, the door wide open, as if his private space were nothing more than overflow parking for her convenience, it struck him not as an isolated offense but as the culmination of every whispered comment, every veiled suggestion that he did not truly belong. A violation so personal, it stripped away the illusion of neighborly civility and exposed the raw entitlement beneath. Standing in his driveway, staring at her car where his own should have been, the weight of history pressed on his chest. The memory of headlines about black homeowners harassed for existing in the wrong neighborhoods, of men and women criminalized for defending what was theirs, of entire families made to feel like trespassers in homes they had worked twice as hard to earn. The garage remote in his palm felt suddenly heavier, not a plastic tool, but a decision, a chance to reclaim a boundary that had been crossed too many times. And as he pressed the button and the door slid shut, with an echoing finality, it was as if years of swallowed frustration locked in with the vehicle. Word spread quickly, the neighborhood's tranquility cracking under the weight of the spectacle. Neighbors stepping onto porches, phones recording, whispers rising into debates about property rights, about race, about whether Marcus was overreacting or finally standing up for himself. Karen's outrage became the center of attention, her voice shrill, her arguments tangled, her entitlement laid bare for all to see, yet beneath her fury was a discomfort she could not hide. The sudden awareness that the privilege she had wielded so casually had limits when confronted with resolve. For Marcus, the moment was less about Karen's car than about what it symbolized. The refusal to keep shrinking himself to fit into a space that was never designed for his comfort. The determination to resist being defined by others' prejudices. The courage to demand the respect his neighbors took for granted. In the days that followed, the HOA scrambled to manage the fallout. Meetings filled with tension as policies were scrutinized, accountability demanded, and Karen's once dominant voice began to falter under the weight of collective recognition that her authority had been built on exclusion and bias. Some neighbors admitted, quietly, that they had seen the unfairness all along but had chosen silence over confrontation. Their guilt a mirror of a larger truth about complicity in injustice, while others found themselves questioning the rules they had once enforced without thought, realizing that order without equity was nothing more than control. For Marcus, the victory was not in Karen's humiliation but in the shift it sparked. The conversations that broke the silence, the understanding that dignity was not granted by committees or neighbors but claimed through courage. And though the change was slow, fragile, and incomplete, it was real. Each night as he locked his garage, he carried the memory of that day not as a tale of pettiness or revenge but as a lesson in boundaries, in resilience, in the power of saying enough when the world expects compliance. And to those who hear his story, who recognize pieces of their own struggles in his, the question remains: how many injustices have been tolerated in the name of peace? How many boundaries crossed in the hope of belonging? And when the moment comes to choose between silence and dignity, which will you claim? Because in the end, neighborhoods are not defined by the houses that line their streets, but by the courage of those who dare to stand within them, unshaken, unyielding, and unapologetically themselves. So, if this story moved you, if it made you think about fairness, justice, or the weight of silence, don't just walk away, share it. Let others reflect too. And remember that change often begins, not with grand gestures, but with one person refusing to be erased. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe stories like these deserve to be heard, because awareness is the first step toward a world where belonging is